So today I want to talk to you about this book, Indebted, How Families Make College Work at Any Cost by Caitlin Zaloom, who is a cultural anthropologist at NYU, and this book was published in 2019 from Princeton University Press. Now, who should be interested in this book? Anyone who has gone to college and has gotten themselves some student loan debt. Now, we know that in the United States alone, that amount of money equals $1.77 trillion and is the largest debt, only in second place to home mortgages. So clearly, student debt is a huge burden on anyone going to college or even considering college. And so that has to be part of the factor when considering whether to go to college and to consider the college premium that should get you a higher wage job. But these jobs are less and less secure in the future, but the debt is as secure as ever because this is the only debt you cannot bankrupt out of. So let's get into this book and see what she has to say, not only about the statistics of student loan debt, but also the ideology, the moral imperatives embedded within the systems of what she calls the student loan financial complex. So chapter 1, introduction. The first sentence in chapter 1, the introduction, states college, where to go and how to pay for it is a central concern of contemporary middle-class families because higher education shapes young people's future possibilities. She continues to state, today being middle class means being indebted. In the second paragraph, she introduces her research methods, saying this book is based on a unique research study, more than 160 in-depth interviews with parents and students who are taking on debt to pay for higher education. She started with her own students and student body at NYU. NYU, of course, is a huge contributor to student loan debt accumulation, so that is ironic, but she also studied college attendees in Michigan for a comparison point. In this introduction, she states that Indebted argues that the problem of paying for college today involves such profound moral, emotional, and economic commitments that it has, in fact, redefined the experience of being middle class. So in this book, she's talking about the morality and the emotional sentiment embedded in this entire endeavor of higher education as we see it today. So this introduction is just setting up the context of how the middle class is indebted. And she's stating that from the very beginning, when a child is born, or even in the mind, that the family feels compelled to buy a house in a good school district so that the child from the very first school that they enter can be in a good school, in a better school than others, so that this can potentially and hopefully track them into a better situation for a college experience and track them into a highly selective college. And of course, since the 1980s, the 1990s, with the neoliberal turn to the university system and the underfunding coming from the federal government and the state governments, the debt burden shifted from the government onto one of the students themselves. And so therefore, in this book, she's also examining this system for financing higher education and the moral imperatives that are even embedded within the forms that people fill out. And in this book with her participants, she's specifying a particular middle class demographic where the parents make too much money and have too much wealth for their children to qualify for major federal higher education grants. She also introduces the perspective in this introduction that investing in a college education is actually speculative because these open futures and these job securities and high-paying jobs in the future are not guaranteed. So going to college and being a college graduate is a cornerstone of being a middle-class American in today's economy. So there's this both economic pragmatic view that getting a college degree will result in a higher paying job and better future potential. But there's also this desire of just the fantasy of what college can be as an experience and the tremendous lengths and debts in which a family will go to pursue that endeavor for their child and their child's potential future. So previously, and we can see in the statistics, that a college education back in the 60s and the 70s was quite affordable, that someone could work a summertime job and pay for their college expenses, and this includes tuition, room, and board. But now the burden has been shifted from the government supporting a higher education onto the students themselves. And now the support for higher education has shifted into a model dependent on loans. She points to federal legislation such as the Higher Education Act of 1965 and its reauthorization in 1972, as well as the Middle Income Student Assistance Act of 1978, which together established and expanded the federal loan program. At the time, the government didn't want to get into the business of offering educational loans itself, and so it incentivized banks. In the 1980s and onward, there were tax advantage investment accounts established specifically to save for a college education. And this became part of the financial industrial complex itself. Of course, in 1981, we see with Ronald Reagan and his budget director, David Stockman, this ideological shift from the government supporting higher education, shifting it onto the individual. So in this introduction, she has a section called The Student Finance Complex. And she talks about the development of this sector of the banking finance industry that is now based on student loan financing, investment accounts for parents to save educational money for their children, and even private banks repackaging loans and selling them to investors as student loan asset-backed securities, SLABs. So there's an entire labyrinth that she talks about, the student finance complex. And within this introduction, she's also introducing, besides the structure of the student finance complex, the moral mandates embedded in this ideology. In the first place, she's saying that mandate is that students go to college in the first place, that this is a requirement, rather than perhaps jobs should pull back in their educational requirements. And it was interesting in this introduction, she's talking about the specifics of the financial aid form, FAFSA, and filling it out. And she's saying that it's written from the perspective of the student, yet it includes the need for financial information that the student, the child, wouldn't have about their parents. And that, of course, it embeds within itself this normative expectation of what a family is, a nuclear family, two parents that communicate with each other, that share financial information, and that will work with this process. And that it's just a parent to child's definition of the family. And so she talks about how this FAFSA form excludes many types of families, and of course just this situation where you have the child has to get financial information from both their parents. And so the author is pointing out you can have situations where the parents are divorced, they're not speaking to each other, they're not financially supporting that child, and so on. It's impossible then to fill out this form. But just that the form itself had this embedded expectation of the moral imperative to go to college, that the entire family structure might support this individual in their endeavor, and that parents are communicating this kind of financial information to the child and working together as a unit. So also in this introduction, she talks a bit more about her process and how she first began collecting interviewees from the NYU student body, and then branched out to Michigan to a public university there, and that she had to talk to both students and their parents. She just couldn't tell the story with just one of those pieces. And it was interesting that she also pointed out the child and the parents often do not share this type of financial information amongst themselves. And so often children didn't know the situation of how much tuition money they were paying, or how much of a burden this was to their parents. And indeed, the parents sheltered that information from the child and didn't want them to worry about it. So in the final part of this introduction, she presents the book overview, and she says that each chapter highlights a component of the system, one financial tool, and examines the central conflict it introduces into families' lives. And so this book is just a close reading also of the financial instruments that have been developed in order to finance higher education, and also just the ideological concepts embedded within each of these financial tools, and how it operates in our society, and the impact it has on families that are lasting for decades and decades as these loans are serviced by the child, the student, and also by their parents as well. So chapter 2 is called Best Laid Plans, and it's the first step into this student finance complex, and it starts with the birth of the child, and that there's this idea in society that parents should begin saving for a child's college education as soon as the child is born. And so the author mentioned how New York State had created a tax deduction account of up to $10,000 for parents to put away this kind of money, and just the financial tools that are created so that parents can open these investment accounts that are pre-tax and will save money for the child's future education 18 years down the road. And so she's also talking about just the embodiment of the morality inherent in these concepts and ideas. On page 31, she's saying they embody ideals of parental responsibility and promote the virtues of being good managers of family finance. These financial mechanisms are tools of moral instruction. So the responsible family, they plan their child, they plan the child's higher education, they begin saving properly when that child is just born. These investment accounts were created in order to save for a child's future college education, and cites the surprising fact that only a tiny fraction of American families, 3%, invest in a 529 or related type of account. So these are actually only accounts that wealthy people use, but yet it becomes this political tool as well. And so it's actually a way for wealthy people to shield their money. She says those who do put considerable money into various tax advantaged accounts are quite wealthy, with assets on average 25 times the median of all American families. So these accounts are basically not used by anyone. And in this chapter too, she starts to get into the voices of her participants and just the anxieties and emotions that they're feeling when they think about their planning for college education. And so one of her participants, Laura, stresses that paying for college now requires a whole family to make it happen, highlighting that in their case, this includes 3 generations. So not only did the parents really contribute significantly to their child's higher education, but also that the grandparents put in a lot of capital for this investment as well. And in the second chapter, she has a section called Unpredictable Futures, where she says that getting this college degree does not guarantee an outcome of a stable job or a higher paying job. You can still get your college degree, incur all this debt, and then still have no job or an unstable job. One parent who had a child that was less than responsible, and so considering that the parent might be investing $100,000 into that child's education when the child themselves is not that mentally committed to the endeavor that they're about to take on, and that the parent can incur all this debt for a degree that's not even completed. The author quotes one parent by saying she could have told him, quote, "Zachary, you're not meant for college. You probably won't graduate, so it's not worth the cost for me to send you." And so just the idea that is, the reality of the situation, but that there's just no way that a parent would be allowed to say something like this, that the parent feels morally obligated to support their child in this college endeavor, even though it might not be the proper investment. Or Zachary's case doesn't go to college, and yet they started this investment account where they did save the money. Then some of the accounts stipulate that you can only withdraw, the principal, but not the entire account amount, so that if the child does not go to college and use that money specifically for that purpose, then the money or a part of the money could be lost. And also she just talks about the American savings rate, and she says that in 1975, the personal savings rate in the United States hit a peak of almost 14%. Today it hovers around 2.5%. So people just don't have the built-up of savings to help fund this college education. And so since the parents don't have the savings that they might otherwise have provided to their children for their college educations, they might be pulling out from their retirement funds or pulling out money from their home value, and so sacrificing their own future in order for them to provide for their child. So she's talking a lot about the participants' voices and what her interviewees said to her, and it's just a lot about this emotional anguish of they will do anything for their child's potential future, but it's so much, to sacrifice the money that they're making now, and then their future money, their retirement, their house value. They feel so guilty that they didn't start, saving as soon as the child was born. These kind of moral imperatives that make them feel guilty. And so that's just the first step in this process of when the child is just born, and the savings process until the child does actually go off to college. Chapter 3 is called The Model Family, and in this chapter she digs deeper into the model family that is constructed through these financial aid forms. So the first step of the college process is to fill out the form called the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, also known as FAFSA. The Department of Education processes 20 million of these forms every year. And so she's saying that the FAFSA's definition of parents does not track neatly with the realities of many families. And so there's this expectation of this nuclear family that's communicating properly and so on about financial matters. And just that the family income is considered for the support of this child in their college endeavor, even if the child is already financially independent. And in a lot of cases, the family is not providing financial assistance to the child, but then they're denied access to these loans or more financial aid because their family makes too much money. And so also the FAFSA form and these other loan forms pay attention to certain types of assets or debt liabilities that a family might have and ignore others. So it gets this distorted perspective of a family's financial situation. And so, for example, the author points out that credit cards and other kinds of debt, transportation bills, and medical costs cannot be reported. The FAFSA also blinds itself to the wealth middle-class families built up through the accumulation of equity in the value of their homes and in their tax-advantaged retirement accounts. So those also don't get inputted into the form and held against them. And so she's saying that the FAFSA is an example of a particular type of moral technology, however, a material document that mediates between governments and citizens and sets up this expectation and requirement that the family will lend their support to the child through these financial practices. She says the model family life endorsed in the FAFSA, one that is neat and nuclear with boundaries that end at the thresholds of the home and with two parents who share financial planning responsibilities, freely and regularly communicating about expenses and working together to build savings, was only ever an ideal. It was promoted by the government, schools, and industry. She also talks about how asking for such sensitive information within a family that might have faced certain estrangements, divorce, lack of cooperation, that this could ignite troubles within the family as well. And she also points out that every year approximately 1/3 of FAFSA forms are selected by a risk model for further investigation. And so that can cause delays of financial aid or just additional stress. And so again, in this chapter, she's talking about, the experiences of her participants and that they've done everything right, that they saved for their retirement, that they bought a home in a good school district, that they work professional jobs, and they're still not able to support their child fully within their pursuit of a higher education. And so perhaps they take a loan against their retirement or their house. In this case, in chapter 3 on page 86, she's saying that both of the parents had taken on work outside of their full-time jobs. The extra teaching helped them make the college payments and ward off drawing more from their retirement savings than they've already had to. And so without someone filling out this FAFSA, applying for financial aid, they're certainly not going to get it if they don't apply to, but because their family might not fit this required model and all this information that's required, they might miss out on this opportunity to take on student loan debt for their education. So in chapter 4, Enmeshed Autonomy, she opens with this sentence: "These long-standing aims have come to involve an unavoidable paradox. Independence must be cultivated under conditions not only of intimate connection, but also of extended financial assistance. I call this situation enmeshed autonomy, and this chapter explores the particular tensions it generates in middle-class family life." She's putting it in the context that the requirements to pay so much for college means that families stretch their expenses over decades and take out from places such as savings when the children are young, taking out debt over the college years, paying off loans, and making up the savings deficiencies far in the future. This puts the whole family in this enmeshed position. And in this chapter, she also wants to take a tour of how other countries manage their student loan debt. And so some comparative models of other European models, Australia, New Zealand, to look at how the state provides a more just system. And so, for example, in Australia, it's really tied to, income. And so a person that's not making an income is not required to make a payment. And then the payment is dependent on the percentage of the income. So it's not too overwhelming. Whereas here in the United States, it's either instantly or 6 months after the person graduates from college when that bill comes due, regardless of consideration of whether they have a job or not at that point. So she mentions that Germany, for example, offers free tuition but requires families to support their young adult students' living expenses. And therefore, the result is only about 20% of German students graduate with debt. And of those who do take on loans, half carry less than 4,000 euros into their adult life. Australian graduates repay their loan based on their income, and they don't pay back at all until they earn the equivalent of about 33,000 per year. She also points out that it's not for a lack of students not working. She states that today, more than 3/4 of all college students work during the school year or during school breaks. Almost 2/3 of that is in food service, in retail, or campus employment. And of course, their earnings, she states, are generally modest. And she has a subsection here called Nested Silences, where she says frank conversations about the financial costs of college were remarkably uncommon in the middle-class families I interviewed. So she herself was surprised by the lack of transparency within the parent-child relationship. Even though college is now the second largest expense that typical American middle-class families pay for in their lifetimes, parents rarely disclose to their children the financial sacrifices they face. Children, on the other hand, also avoid asking their parents about the financial strain of college expenses. Chapter 5 is called Race and Upward Mobility, and in this chapter she examines this particular social location of Black families in the United States, considering the recent history of how they are positioned financially against white families, and so they have much of a smaller net worth to pull on when they're considering funding their child's college education. But that also the college degree is considered even more important for this aspiration of upward mobility. And so often families of color then will face even more financial burden because they really do want to pursue this higher education to have that upward upward mobility, but then their lack of resources snowballs into, an end result of a higher debt. And she talks about the history of segregation within education. You have the Higher Education Act, HEA, signed by President Johnson in 1965. And this provided fundings for the Pell Grant for low-income students of all backgrounds to attend college. So that was an expansionist move to bring more people within higher education. The HEA also established direct federal financial support for historically black colleges. And so because of the position of black families in their financial network compared to white American families, therefore, she mentions some statistics like black students carry almost 70% more debt than white students. African American parents on average carry more debt than white parents. And that makes the PLUS loans the riskiest one offered by the federal government. The PLUS loans are specifically a financial tool designed for the parents to sign on to. And this puts black families in a more vulnerable position, as does it put the black colleges and universities into more precarious positions, because these schools are even more heavily reliant on these student loans. And so if it's a question of whether college education and that kind of investment is the best and most appropriate investment for white families, then considering black families and their more serious economic precarity, it's even more questionable of a investment. She says in 1980, more than 3/4 of students at black private colleges relied on financial grant aid to attend, with only 4% having taken on federal guaranteed loans. By 1987, 7 years later, the number taking on loans had climbed to nearly 50%. So created by the Department of Education in 1994 and officially called Parent Loans for Undergraduate Students, PLUS, they are specifically designed to help parents pay the expected contributions when their funds fall short and after the family has exhausted all other aid resources. Families that go into this PLUS program, created in 1994, take on an average of $13,000 of debt per year and pay a higher interest rate. As of the writing, it was 7%. As compared to 4.5 for the federally backed loans. Payment also begins as soon as the loan is approved rather than being deferred until the student's graduation. In addition, parents must pass a credit check in order to be awarded these loans, unlike loans that are given to students without any kind of credit check whatsoever. And so overall, chapter 5 is just pointing out that there's a huge racial discrepancy between black and white families, with black families facing even more levels of student loan indebtedness. The final content chapter, chapter 6, is called Cultivating Potential. And she opens this chapter by saying, among all the things that middle-class families consider when choosing a college, none is so important as which institution will best cultivate their child's potential. So the sense that there's a right college for the child to find to provide the proper environment for their unique individuality. And so perhaps parents are taking their children on college tours, and so maybe every weekend they visit a different college to get a feel for that place and whether it's a perfect fit for the atmosphere for their child. And so it's considered like rudely pragmatic to talk about financial considerations instead of just the dream of this particular college, the feel of this particular college. So she has a section here called The Ritual of College Selection, and how there's a particular script to the family conversations about which college will be chosen. This chapter is basically focusing on the balance in which the child has their dream college, the atmosphere that they're thinking about, where the parents are thinking about the money, but they are still not able to put that as the primary concern. And that's the ideology also with the loan instruments, is that you're capable of borrowing the money, so why not? So in this model too, students are expected to be self-directed, that they learn to define and assess their capabilities and deficiencies, and that they select their classes from a wide variety of departments. They pick their own major, they pick the college that they are going to. And also I would, point out that in Asian families that might be different, right? Like there might be a lot of pressure to the student about which school they should aspire to and what major, what kind of employment trajectory they should take on. She also uses the term that she calls continuous cultivation. The child then internalizes that sense of cultivation to continue to pursue and shape their own potentiality. She's also talking about the time period in this chapter where the child leaves college and goes on out into the world, into the unsecured job market, and begins to pay back these loans and sees then what a burden that is. And that their future is also risk adverse because they have to think about paying back these types of graduate debt. And so finally, chapter 7 is the conclusion, a right to a future. And so basically in this chapter, she's calling for the government to once again support higher education directly and fund higher education and not outsource that debt burden onto the individual. She's talking about debt forgiveness and free tuition. She's talking about just the different kind of political parties on both sides that call for student loan forgiveness and these kinds of promises that they can make to the electorate. She mentions Bernie Sanders campaign on a platform for free college education for all. And again, just looking at Australia and other countries that really do fund the education. She's also making the point that previously the government did fund higher education to a certain premium, and certain generations really benefited from that. And those are the same generations that kind of talk to their children or grandchildren about what to expect from higher education, and that it's an undeniable good that will lead to a more secure future. And that is just, as she says, speculative. So this is a great book for people that, find themselves within this sociological situation of carrying student debt, being one of 44 million other Americans, and just not only the institutional structures that create this student financial complex, the politics and the policies that go into it, the historical trajectory, but really to question the morality embedded within these financial tools, the entire industry of student loan debt, and just the requirement of college being central to a middle class existence in the United States. So let me know, if you can relate to this situation of student loan debt, and how have you managed the situation, and have you been able to pay off your debt, default? I don't know, how's it going out there with the student debt situation? Obviously, I'm studying a lot of books about, the situation of higher education and academia. That's my current research area. So I hope you are interested in the educational institution from a critical perspective. I have a few more books that I want to talk about in this series, so I hope you will join me. Thank you.